And if I can find it, I'll switch on captions too. Okay, I've done both of those things. So welcome everyone to our weekly call. And apologies for the late change of agenda. Anyone that has been following my emails, I had been hoping to have a couple of people sort of present on demand, domain, generation algorithms, but I'll have to put that back to at least next week. I'm just trying to finalise or confirm the availability of the prospective speakers. So in the meantime, I brought forward by a week the planned reflections on the RIPE meeting. So let me just, in a second, I'll just prepare my laptop so I can share my screen. So I realise I'm on the wrong slide. So that should now work. Okay, so I should be sharing my screen now, I hope. So as I say, we're talking about RIPE 90 highlights, so a few reflections from last week, which, as I think there'll be two or three people on the call that were there as well. Feel free to jump in with your thoughts on that. And then, as always, I'll just pick out a few things from the sort of news headlines and highlight a few forthcoming events, etc. And we should have time at the end, if there's anything that anyone would particularly like to raise. I should also say I'm not using my normal laptop because I'm in a hotel at the moment, so I don't have a wide screen. So if you put anything in the chat which I don't immediately pick up on, feel free to draw that to my attention. I'm not ignoring you deliberately. It's just when I'm screen sharing, I can't always see the relevant information panes. So as I say, we may have to do that sort of a manual process if required. Okay, so without further ado, then, I and a few others had the pleasure of spending last week in a very sunny Lisbon, which was lovely, with a very well attended RIPE meeting. I think in the end there were something in excess of 650 people present in person. And I can't remember what the number was of people online as well. So it seemed to be well attended. And I know in parallel with the sort of the main business of the sort of conference, which I'm going to talk about a few things, the NomCom were busily working. So I think Kurt, amongst others, had plenty of other things to be getting on with in addition to attending some of the workshops. Yeah, and I see, Kurt, thank you for putting in the chat, between 50 and 150 remote attendees as well. So between 700 and 850, 900 people present in the various sessions, which was good. So all I was planning to do was just to sort of highlight 3 or 4 things from each day which caught my attention. I obviously didn't go to every session, especially as there were a number in parallel. So that's why if other people were in attendance and feel I missed something important, feel free to jump in and mention that as well. Because having multiple sets of eyes on things is, I think, especially beneficial. But anyway, without further ado, we sort of kicked off, was it midday, I think, on Monday. And the sort of 3 sessions from Monday that I wanted to reference, firstly, effectively sort of the first opening keynote session. Maria Farrell, who's an independent writer from Ireland, gave a presentation sort of titled "How to Rewild the Internet," which some of us would have heard parts of during the ITF meeting in Dublin, because Maria was one of a panel of 3 speakers on Tuesday evening at an event hosted by the one of the Irish internet exchanges, when she sort of touched on the same sort of topic. So well, this time it was her in isolation, completely focused on that subject matter. So she was able to sort of spend more time on it. And in effect, it was her sort of view on why we needed to do something to address the, if anything, accelerating consolidation and centralization of the internet, and what the potential upsides would be from doing that. So quite an interesting, not overly technical at all, presentation early on in the proceedings, just to get people thinking, which I think is no bad thing. Albeit I know a few people I spoke to disagreed with her on the fundamental economics, but nevertheless, it was a good conversation piece, if nothing else, and worth your while sort of watching the replay if you're able to. And I think pretty much all of the sessions, the recordings are now available. The RIPE team are amazingly efficient at getting the recordings up on YouTube. And when I circulate a link to the recording for this, I'll include links to all of the sessions I'm going to mention, by the way. Sorry, Dinesh, I just noticed you got your hand raised. Did you want to jump in on that? And if so, you need to unmute.
Apologies for that. Yeah, I made a comment and raised a question to Maria, and she actually didn't answer it. And I've known Maria for many, many years, so I took her to one side once she had finished, and she apologized to me and said, "Thank you for not butting in and getting me away from the point I was trying to make."
Hmm.
But my point was about those who weren't in the room, because Maria's thing was that there are commercial organizations within the internet space, and they're all in. So I'll paraphrase: they're all working in silos for their own benefit. So you look at Facebook, Google, et cetera, and things like that, and it's what they want to do for our space, but for their benefit. And I raised the point that I find that's also happening within the non-profit part of our community, because I'm finding that the people. So even though with a bottom-up approach, the people on the ground level are mingling with each other and sharing knowledge and helping each other. It's when it comes to the high levels, such as board levels, they're not really talking to each other because they're focused on their own communities. Yes, there is some crossover, but they're mainly focusing on their own communities. And my main point was, actually, I personally believe that currently in today's time and age, that the boards of the non-profit sector now are not really fit for purpose. So that was the point I was trying to make, and that needs to be looked at and things like that. So, and that's my part of rewilding the internet, in that needs to be looked at, because it is a serious issue. A lot of the boards are, in my view, beauty pageants and beauty contests. It's popularity contests rather than what's actually needed for the organization and the wider community. So that's the point I was trying to make.
Right. Yeah, and I do now vaguely remember that. Monday last week seems a long time ago, to be fair,
Yes.
Dinesh. But yes, I guess, as you say, she was more concentrating her attention on the sort of the big platforms. So yeah, didn't directly sort of cover that. But yeah, thanks for that reminder. And there were other points from the floor as well, I should say, all of which I'm sure will be picked up by the recording. And then following on from Maria, Timo Hilbrink from Freedom Internet, Dutch ISP, gave an interesting presentation. He was previously involved in an ISP. I must admit, I've momentarily forgotten the name of it, which was taken over by KPN, originally as a standalone sort of brand, but ultimately absorbed into KPN, and in some ways sort of closed down. So the people that were focused on it as a standalone organization effectively sort of parted company with KPN. So they then went on to start up a new ISP from scratch, as the title says, with zero resources, specifically money. So he explains how they addressed that with some crowdfunding and so on. to establish Freedom Internet, which I believe is, if not the biggest, certainly it has the biggest reach, I think was how he phrased it, of the Dutch ISPs in terms of covering multiple different networks where it's available on a retail basis. So he sort of just talked about his the journey, how they got to where they are today, which was good to hear. And then the last one from Monday, just sort of a reference, is which we've touched on briefly previously on this call, is keeping up with the times, updating ICP2. ICP2 being the Internet Coordination Policy, which is effectively the policies which govern the RIRs like RIPE and ARIN and APNIC and so on, which are about 20 or so years old. I think they were written early 2001, something like that, and are in the process of being amended, and the draft is out for public consultation. So this came up a couple of times during the week at RIPE, where some of the people involved in redrafting were repeatedly prompted the community to take a look at the draft and provide their comments. So this was in the plenary on Monday was the first time that the topic came up, but as I say, it was revisited later on in the week as well. And yes, thank you, Kurt. Better memory than me. Access for All was the precursor to Freedom Internet, which was absorbed over several years into KPN, but then the sort of founding team sort of started again. Anyway, so that was it for me from Monday. If anyone else wants to jump in, if they think I've missed anything significant, now will be your opportunity. And if not, I will move onwards. And there'll be time at the end as well if anyone suddenly remembers something to jump in. On day 2, again, I pick out roughly the same number of things each day. Although there's plenty of other stuff. So by omission, if it's not there, doesn't mean to say it wasn't interesting. Leslie Daigle, known to many of us from activities in the ITF. She's actually CTO of the Global Cyber Alliance, and she gave a presentation, sort of microplastics of the internet. And she was using the analogy of microplastics to sort of reference the, as she phrased it, the malicious background traffic, the continuous level of malicious background traffic on the internet, which is always there. And really her call to action was for ISPs and potentially others to establish reasonable norms to actually try and address this sort of pollution, as she referred to it. So rather than just accepting that it's always there, just highlighting it and suggesting that we need to tackle it, because it's potentially quite a notable sort of overhead in terms of the net amount of traffic on the internet, which is malicious. So I thought was a point well made and quite a nice analogy with microplastics in that sense. Also, again, in terms of sort of shared learnings, Pavel Korotiv from 1ix.eu, a Ukrainian ISP, shared some learnings of the sort of Ukrainian sort of ISP sector, mainly about how they needed to, over several years, adapt their practices to provide much better resilience. So, for example, not being wholly reliant on mains electricity, having multiple different routes, moving their core infrastructure out of obvious locations into more inconspicuous buildings, and a whole lot of other things besides. Unsurprisingly, given Pavel's obviously sort of lives in Ukraine, a lot of his presentation was sort of pre-recorded, included some sort of video discussions with people in, I think there's about 4 or 5 other ISPs. So really sort of interesting how they've managed to survive in very challenging circumstances, and potentially some useful learning practices for people operating sort of ISPs, maybe not in quite such challenging circumstances, but maybe just highlighting what not to take for granted, maybe to have sort of common parts, etc. So, but yeah, a good reminder of what good operating practices might look like from a resilience point of view. And then the last one I'll mention from the Tuesday, then I'll pause again in case anyone wants to highlight anything, is the RIPE Security Working Group, which took place later on Tuesday, had a number of presentations, including one from a representative from Europol. And I think there were several people from Europol present throughout the week, talking about some of the challenges faced by law enforcement agencies and who has came up amongst other things, and also some of the obligations on the community through different legislation. And then that was followed by two different people from the ICANN office of the CTO who talked about different facets of DNS abuse research, one covering maliciously registered domains and how to identify those, or what some of the commonalities were between different types of maliciously registered domains and similarly batch registered domains, typically using domain generation algorithms. And for example, for the first sort of category, maliciously registered domains, know your customer came up quite frequently as a common denominator, as did the availability of APIs to register. And APIs, unsurprisingly, also came up quite strongly with batch registered domains. So a couple of interesting presentations. I'll just mention, go back to the Europol one. Possibly that because the representative from Europol had a fairly forceful presentation style. I think that was just his personal style. He had some pushback from some people within the RIPE community, basically questioning why they should have any of these obligations and whether it was appropriate for the internet to have such things, which I'm personally, I'm not comfortable with that perspective, but you obviously get a multiple variety of different viewpoints at an event such as RIPE. So there was some pushback on him, also questioning whether they even understood how the internet worked, which I thought was pushing the boundaries of the sort of behavioural standards of RIPE, but and could have probably been better expressed. But anyway, so again, the security working group you may well want to watch that, especially for the two ICANN presentations, which covered some very interesting material. Yeah, as I can see, if anyone else wants to jump in with anything from day two, feel free to do so at this point.
Yes, please, other people, please do the same because I don't want to be seen to be taking advantage of this space. But day two, there were another couple of things that I was involved in. One was the NOG Organizers Group, and the NOG Organizers Group is something supported by RIPE NCC to bring network operator groups within the RIPE community all together to discuss things. And I was involved this time around on the Tuesday lunchtime. It normally takes place at lunchtimes at every RIPE meeting. And this time around, because I'm no longer with DNS Oracle nor UK North, I had my PT-Nog hat on where I was a co-founder from many years ago, and just talking about issues to do with the space in Portugal and the collaboration and the difficulties that we have and looking at how to do things moving forward. From that came that was followed up by something on Thursday, which I'll come to later about PT-Nog. But that was the NOG organizers thing. And the second thing that I was involved in is I chaired the diversity, equity, and inclusion session at the end of Tuesday, just before the social. And there were two topics there. One was by Maria Matejka, about how she sees things are still lacking in the right community to make things much more accessible and inclusive for those with certain needs. And the other one was a panel discussion, was a presentation and a feedback session from the audience by Laura Lorenzo, who is a consultant at RIPE NCC. And this was about, well, it's called the mentorship program, but as I pointed out on stage, I prefer to call it the mentee program because really it's about the mentees rather than the mentors. It's for the benefit of the mentees. But that was an hour long, and unfortunately, I didn't have time for a longer session, but it could easily have gone on for an hour and a half. That's it.
Okay, thanks, Dinesh. And as I say, anyone else with any observations from each day, sort of jump in as we go through as well. Um, okay, I'll move on to day three, which was for me the sort of highlight of my sort of week. It included the RIPE DNS working group, unsurprisingly. Which amongst other topics, and again, I'm not covering everything, just for speed, but there was a presentation on post-quantum cryptography algorithms within Bind and some testing that's been done, looking at the overhead and the performance of those. There was also an interesting presentation on SPF, DKIM, and DMARC within the .fr domain area, highlighting some misconfigurations, etc. And I think the key message at the end, so I'm synthesizing a half-hour presentation into less than a sentence, so I'm obviously not doing it justice, was that errors in any or all of those settings can leave domains exposed to hijacking. So that was really the point of the sort of presentation, but definitely worth watching that one. Are my slides still sharing? So I just had a message querying. Yeah, they are. Okay. So if anyone's not seeing the slide sharing, maybe just quickly reset on that. Yeah, and then sort of best current operating practice for DNS filtering, which is mainly highlighting the extended and structured error codes for DNS and where and how they might be used, which I think some interpreted as making the case for censorship by some definitions of censorship, which I didn't take it as that. I just took it as just making sure there was awareness of their existence and potential use cases for them. But again, if you watch that presentation, you can obviously draw your own conclusions on it. But I thought it was a useful sort of presentation. And as I say, but I'm conscious. I think Dinesh, you gave a presentation here on feedback from the hackathon. So
Yeah.
just to emphasize the point that where I've not mentioned things, it was more for time
Yeah,
and
no, that's
brevity, not
completely fine.
for anything else.
Yeah, no, completely fine. May I just interject a little bit?
Please,
Just yeah. So those, on behalf of DNS on behalf of OARC when I was at DNS OARC, I co-hosted a hackathon in Stockholm. I know a few people here. Alexi, I can see, was one of the participants there. So, as well as at NetNode, I was invited by the chairs of the DNS working group to give an update on that hackathon. Actually, things have slightly changed since then in terms of so the guy who did the BCOP for DNS filtering talk, Asbjorn, he's actually, even though he was involved, he was at the hackathon, and even though he was involved in the LHB project, he actually has already implemented one of the other projects, which is the CanDNS authoritative server. And so he used some of that to do his BCOP and DNS filtering stuff. So it was a nice tie into my talk where he had already spoken about CanDNS as authoritative server stuff. Yeah, so I just gave that update. Some things have changed. There was also the thing to do with the IETF draft by the LHB guys. And that was it. And also cheekily, I stood on stage and mentioned that please hire me, and my QR code was going to my website. And if anyone was interested in hiring them, please do so. But I thought I'd make use of that opportunity within a crowd that who knows me for many, many years and decades. But yeah, no, that was it really. Thank Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. And as an aside, so I didn't have time to mention it to you at the time, since one of the topics for the hackathon was Doe over Tor, just to say, and it's in the archives of these talks, I know at least one person that implemented Doe over Tor and had a working implementation about 4 or 5 years ago. And in fact, to the extent that he rotated, I think every 30 seconds between multiple different resolvers for his resolver capability within that. But yeah, that's a discussion for another day, but just whilst it's on my mind. And then later on in the day, we had the IoT working group at RIPE. That was incredibly interesting. I mean, certainly to me, it's not an area I spend so much time thinking about. It was a fantastic presentation by an assistant professor from University College London. They spend time looking at the hundreds of different devices to see how secure that they are. So it was the first talk there on policy certification and verification for cybersecurity in IoT. And two things that jumped out at me. She talked about smart TVs and something called automated content recognition, a sort of Shazam for TV content, which apparently on most smart TVs you're automatically opted into, so you have to opt out. If you don't opt out, then the TV will regularly check to see what you're watching, and it doesn't use the smarts of the TV to do it as such. It's listening to what you're watching and working out what it is. So, for example, if you try and overcome that by playing content through the HDMI socket, it will still determine what you're watching. And in terms of frequency, if I get my brands correct, I think she said Samsung TVs check roughly every 500 milliseconds and LG TVs roughly every 50 milliseconds. So they really are aggressively monitoring what content is being watched using those TVs unless you opt out. The good news was if you do opt out, then it does seem to be effective and does stop monitoring, but you have to delve into the menu system to press the relevant button to do that. There were also presentations on detecting attacks on IoT devices using honeypot data and operational and security best practices for DNS in the Internet of Things. And also Michael Richardson, who's often on this call, talked about the state of device identifiers. That should be, I'll fix that when I share the slides. And also, sorry, go back to that first presentation, she also highlighted how insecure some wearable devices are, things like glucose monitors, blood pressure monitors, sort of blood oxygen sort of monitors, etc., and how vulnerable to attack they are using Bluetooth Low Energy. So you have to have physical proximity to do it, but the attacks seemed relatively simple in several cases. So that was somewhat alarming. And then just to wrap up, actually, let me just pause there in case anyone else had anything to interject with. Fair point I can see that you made with regards. So some of the chats over breakfast, I completely agree. The chat that you and I had with Jeff Houston certainly was very stimulating. In fact, I had another one the next day with Jeff, which I'll maybe mention at the end. And thanks. I see that Dinesh has shared a link to Alex's paper on Doe over Tor. I'll share a link to the recording in the link with this recording as well, so you have that to reference, and you can hear him presenting it on this call several years ago. Okay, right. Anyway, let's just briefly move on to day 4, the open source working group. Several interesting presentations, not least of which by Vicky Risk of ISC, who's again often on this call, who shared some data about money and open source sustainability and highlighted some sort of different approaches that ISC has tested to try and generate some revenue to help sustain their open source efforts. And she shared several years worth of revenue for a couple of different approaches. uh, which was really good, particularly as she had a lot of negativity apparently 2 or 3 years ago when she'd shared an earlier iteration of presentation with the RIPE community and went back to basically say, at least with one facet of that presentation, that the community was right and the approach didn't work. But at least they tested it, and they now seem to have a viable method of generating some revenues to help cover the cost of the open source development. Also, Andre Suri, again of ISC, shared some work that they've done to try and streamline some of the code in the latest version of Bind 9, and that seems to have been pretty successful. Again, to summarize his half a presentation into a sentence. And amongst other things, Maria Pajenka from ZZNet just shared her experiences of moving from being a senior developer to growing and leading a team, and what differences that made. Which was quite interesting, as people sort of learn how to sort of delegate and what works, what doesn't, etc. And then the last one I'm going to mention, because I wasn't there on day 5, the cooperation working group. Beric gave a presentation about the IP interconnection ecosystem at the start, but I wasn't in the room for that, so I can't comment on that. But then there were 3 separate presentations on our vulnerable infrastructure, covering some of the recent sort of cable breaks, mainly but not exclusively in Scandinavia, and what impact some of that physical cable damage has had on the traffic. So, if you like, there's both a report on the cable breaks themselves and then a separate presentation looking at the analysis, traffic analysis, and then finally a presentation looking at the impact of the recent power outages in Spain and Portugal. So it's a package of 3 presentations covering 3 different facets of the, where the infrastructure breaks down and whether and how resilient it is. And I think Kurt had mentioned that in the chat a short while ago. There's that being one of the highlights, and I agree, because it was good to actually see some practical measurements from that, what it actually looks like. The last presentation there was a multi-stakeholder forum on internet standards deployment, which is a sort of European Commission initiative to try and encourage and sort of drive the take up of a range of different standards, which again, in my opinion, got some surprising pushback from the community, really questioning whether that was appropriate and why the Commission were interfering. Which I thought was a relatively benign presentation. But again, if you have time to watch that, you can draw your own conclusions one way or the other. I personally thought it's quite a useful initiative, particularly given that there are regulatory obligations in some industry sectors to actually take some of these standards up. For example, because of NIS2, DORA, etc., depending on the different sectors. And that was it from me. So before I just briefly to move on to some of the headlines from the last week, again, I'll just pause in case anyone either has got any observations from day 5 or from anything else that came up through the week that you thought was noteworthy. So Dinesh has physically raised his hand, so come in first, and then anyone else as well, feel free to do so.
So yeah, Dinesh again. So there were another couple of things that I had become involved in on the Thursday, day 4. One of them. So one of the things that I truly believe in is building the community and the right community, because most of us are aging and we need replacing at some point to take the industry forward. So I was invited to a Thursday morning session, which was a workshop about the fellowship program at RIPE. And so basically feedback on, is the fellowship program working? How can it be made better? There were about 25 of us in the room. So it was a really good session set into different things like the application stage, the during the just before the meeting stage, the during the meeting stage, and after the meeting stage for fellows and newcomers. So it was really good. And so RIPE NCC are looking at how to make that better. So it was a very good workshop feedback session. We were in teams working on various things. And the other thing that RIPE NCC were very kind in allowing me to use the side room during lunchtime, because we rebooted PTNOG. And PTNOG has had issues, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of building community over time. COVID happened, and the business environment within Portugal is uh, not really so much into collaboration, which I've tried to change. And it did work initially, but then of course COVID happened, and then people got different jobs and they became busy and everything. So we rebooted it, and basically everyone who turned up in the room to discuss this and listen to us is now a PC member. But the outcome of that was that instead of having a full PTNOG meeting to start with, what will happen is that there will be, similar to Net Manchester and things like that. Net Lisbon is an already established brand within PTNOG, so Net Lisbon will happen for 4 or 5 months first, each and every month, before we before we do a full PTNOG. Now, for those who don't know, Net Manchester, Net London, which is where Net Lisbon got its um, inspiration from, is a very informal 2 hours, two maybe 3 hours in the evening in some commercial space, in some pub or something like that, or a separate room in a pub, where maybe one or two talks, you may or may not need slides. And it's just very informal. You buy your own drinks, you buy your own food, and there's no sponsors. And it's basically to get people to come along who may be busy during the day anyway. And then once they've presented there, maybe they will get confident enough to do at a full meeting, or even at Alex's Phenog as well, and things like that. So it's more a matter of bringing people into the forums, and so making them more confident to go to the more to the bigger ones. Um, and thankfully, we've got not only support from Portugal, but we've got support from Spain, and we've got support from NetNode in Stockholm as well, who are going to support PTNOG logistically as well, and with the programming things. The next stage is to look at finances, and that's it really. But yeah, PTNOG's being rebooted.
Excellent. Good to hear. Thanks for that, Dinesh. So there's plenty of other things happening around the right meeting, as that rather amply demonstrates. Okay, right. Let me then sort of move on, just change tack to talk about some of the headlines from the last week, which, as always, if you don't get my weekly headlines email and would like to, just ping me an email and I'll add you to the mailing list. And equally, as always, I won't cover everything on these, just highlight two or three, which I think are of special interest. Some research published in the last week by Nathan Allen of the DNS Research Federation, talking about some of the issues caused by name collisions between the sort of traditional DNS, if you like, and some of the blockchain-based naming systems, which, as he sort of touches on in the article that accompanies the research, this is likely to become increasingly important as potentially additional naming systems come out, and some of them at least become more widely used. So there's a greater likelihood of collisions. It's research sponsored by, I think it was Afrinic. I think it's so in the article. So it's good to see that it's covered, but probably something of growing importance over the next few years. And then just sort of bottom of the screen, there's a useful piece on dynamic DNS and why that was being exploited by a range of different malicious actors for different sort of types of different types of attacks. One of the examples given being something that's been christened Scattered Spider, which uses dynamic DNS to hide its malicious activities and enable its phishing attacks. But there was at least one other example in the article on dark reading, so that was quite interesting. A few bits and pieces around attacks on cryptocurrencies, which seem to come up with alarming regularity, so it shouldn't really be a surprise. A few bits on there. Quite a nice pun on DNS, do or don't. Further down the screen, and actually a particularly nice piece with a slightly weird title. I kept adding network defenses at home until my girlfriend started screaming. which is actually an experiment which someone started to enable different types of blocking until uh, another user, specifically his girlfriend, came complaining that the stuff had completely broken. And it took quite a lot before things started to break. So he then re-enabled the things that were broken, obviously, but I think was keen to highlight just what a high percentage of traffic he was able to block with no apparent impact whatsoever. As I say, it was interesting. And then just briefly, a couple of other things you'll see at the bottom of this screen. Centre have just published their report on the ITF 122 meeting in Bangkok, so there's a link to that. Uh, ICANN have got a readout on their forthcoming ICANN 83 meeting in Prague, I think. So shortly afterwards, there's in middle of next month, there's actually already scheduled, I think it's about an hour and a half readout on the event, which is good to see. That's already in the diary. And just a reminder also that OARC, there's a call for contributions for the next meeting already open. The meeting coming up not so far away in the middle of October, sorry, the beginning of October, rather, in Stockholm. So the 7th and 8th of October. So the sort of call for contributions is open for a little while longer. And then there's a whole bunch of other things which we don't have time to go into, but maybe just highlight the first one on that list. There's an interesting podcast, I think it was, with Jeff Houston, since his name was mentioned earlier, just talk about the evolution of network architecture, but numerous other things as well that have caught my eye over the last week, which we don't have time to talk about now, but some of those may be of interest to you as well. So that's why I share them. In terms of deadlines coming up, I mentioned the ICP2 consultation. So the deadline for responses to that, you see the third bullet down on this, is the 27th of May, so towards the end of this month. So you've got another week or so if you're minded to share your thoughts on the sort of, the governance of the regional internet registries. Fairly fundamental part of the ecosystem. And then into next month, there's a call for presentations for Net UK 2, the John Postel Award, APNIC 60 in July, and also OARC 45 at the end of July. So 5 or 6 weeks till that one closes. And then almost finally, quite a few things coming up. I mentioned the ICANN 83 readout in the middle of June, as you can see, just a week or so after the meeting itself, a whole bunch of other stuff. And just a reminder, I'll be at Oslo or Lillestrøm for the IGF meeting in the latter part of next month. So if you're there, come and say hello. And likewise for the ITF meeting in Madrid in late July, so the following month, which I know some of you will also be at. And then finally, as I mentioned, I'll try and get the sort of demand generation algorithms sort of talk in next week. So I'll confirm that by email as soon as that date's firmed up. There's a few other things I'm trying to line up, not least of which the one at the bottom dates TBA on the back of a discussion over breakfast one morning in Lisbon. Jeff Houston has agreed to come on the call to talk about his thoughts for redoing how the DNS route works, fundamentally redoing a key piece of the DNS infrastructure. I won't steal his thunder and share what that is, but he feels that the current system is, by many definitions of the word, extremely inefficient, and we could be a lot smarter in how that's done. But again, as soon as that date's firmed up, I'll let you know. And that, I think, is it from me, other than say thank you to our sponsors, DNS OARC, long-term sponsors of this call, and to ask, does anyone else have anything that you want to mention? So Alexei, if you want to mention something on the 17th of June, since I'm not sure what the NOG is, so feel free to unmute and just expand on that briefly. You're very welcome to do so.
So Dennis already mentioned that there are NOG meetings everywhere, and I'll turn my camera on too. So we've got a Finnish NOG meeting on the 17th of June. And that is the URL for the event, and the registration is also there.
Fantastic. I will add that to the list, and shamelessly use that as an excuse to remind everyone, if there's anything you think I have missed that is coming up, as Alexei just did, please send me a link, and I'll happily add that to the list so that you're aware of it. So that, yes, that absolutely does count, to answer the question you posed in the chat. Okay, just see if anyone else has got anything else on your mind that you wanted to share whilst we're on the call. Again, just feel free to pop it in the chat if that's easiest. Otherwise, just unmute and talk. Either's fine. Jump in, Kurt, please.
Yeah, hi. Coming back to that power outage in Spain and Portugal, it was interesting from a not just network perspective, but an overall how did things go off the net and grid after all? So there were two sessions basically from visibility on the global side, which was not impacted very much. So I think it is worthwhile checking out these two recordings about the effects of the power outage to, I would say, even some longer term things that were running on batteries or generator power. And even that was very interesting to see how things struggle after some hours to come back due to traffic jams and 1,000 other items that would probably make some people think about their contingency plans and emergency things they have set up. And it's probably really an advice to look at this, what happened in which time order after such a big event on a countrywide scale. I think this is really a hint.
Yeah, totally agree. It's not often such things are properly tested. So there's a lot of people that could learn from that and fine tune their current contingency plans. Totally agree with your point. It did throw up a lot of interesting points, and of course, it also in one of the sessions, I think it was the one later in the week, some of the stuff automatically rerouted. I think it's to do with the cable breaks more specifically. A lot of the traffic automatically rerouted, as you might expect with the internet. But of course, I was then thinking about some of the proposals in the ITF for, is it NASA? I think it's the acronym, which I think has been sidelined now, but where people wanted to effectively hardwire connections to a specific route. And I know in the discussion for the BOF for that in Bangkok and previously, I think in Vancouver, a number of people at the mic made the point it would make the internet a lot more brittle, a lot more vulnerable to outages. And I think the experiences with the cable breaks and potentially also the power outages would rather underline that point, that you would, rather than automatically routing around the problem, if possible, you may lose the connection completely, which is perhaps not such a good thing. But then maybe that's just confirmation bias, because I thought that was a particularly silly idea. So maybe others would take a different point of view. But yeah, thanks for that, Kurt. Okay, final chance. If anyone else has anything else you want to share or comment on? I'm not seeing anyone unmuting nor typing. So with that in mind, then I hope that was useful. As I say, with the recording, I share links to the various sessions as well. So all of the recordings for all the sessions are already available, plus all the slides, etc. So thanks everyone for your time. Have a fantastic week, and look forward to catching up same time next week. See you.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
Thanks. Goodbye.
Bye bye.